So the web pages these days are alive, and that's what we're doing with JavaScript and the DOM. All right, so that's the basics there. Now, what happens when you click on an element in the DOM, such as this image tag here? Well, I like to think about events kind of like triggers in the database. We know we have DDL triggers and DML triggers, and we can basically attach code to some kind of event happening. And they're very much the same events in JavaScript. So it's important to note that browsers are automatically going to trigger all kinds of events as users are interacting with the web page, such as the change of an item's value or the click of a button. Those the browser does. But you can also do custom events as well. And the Apex framework actually already makes use of this. For example, when you refresh a report in Apex, a custom event is fired. But you can also make use of this your own. You can make up your own events if and when that's necessary. You'll see an example later of how that can be useful. Let's look at how events work at a programmatic level. And I know with dynamic actions, the whole point is to avoid code, but sometimes it can help to understand what's going on under the hood, so to speak. So here what we have is what you might see in Apex rather often, a report with some rows, and perhaps in the rows you have a button. And the idea is they're going to click the button and something's going to happen, right? Well, the way we might do this programmatically, this $sign here is a reference to jQuery. So I'm invoking jQuery and I'm passing it this string known as a selector. It starts with a period, so I'm selecting by class, and I'm selecting elements with a class of report button. So implicitly, we kind of know that these buttons must have that class. And then I'm using the on method, and I'm binding to the click event on these buttons. And I'm passing a second parameter here to on, which is known as a callback function. This function will not be executed now. It will be executed in the future when someone clicks on a button. So it kind of looks like this. This is how you could visualize it. We have, I've colored these buttons here so you could imagine direct event bindings on the button, right? Now, what is the problem with that? Well, when the user clicks a button like this, refresh report, perhaps go on an interactive report filter kind of thing, well, we get new rows in the report, and those come with new buttons. And all of a sudden, they click the buttons, and it doesn't work. And you can visualize that like this. New content, brought in new buttons. The event bindings that were there before on the old buttons, those are gone, not going to work anymore. Well, let's take a look a little bit closer at what happens with events and see if we can come up with a solution. Now, here what you're seeing is a hierarchical structure. We have an HTML document with a body. It has a table with a row and a table data element. Now, imagine you click this table data element. Could you have done that without also having clicked the row or the table or the entire document itself? No, of course not, right? So the way that browsers handle this situation, they don't just trigger the event on the very thing that you clicked, because you actually clicked a lot of other things. So the events travel in 3 different phases. They start at the top in what's known as the capture phase, and they work their way down until they get to where you actually clicked, and that's going to be the target phase. And then the event will travel back up in what's known as the bubbling phase. And most of the time when we create an event listener like you saw me do on the previous page, most of the time we're working just with the bubbling phase. We don't work usually with capture and target phases, although you can programmatically if needed. So why do you care, right? Well, back to where we were before, there's a neat thing that we can do to take advantage of this, and it's called event delegation. So now I have some new code in the front here. It's actually very close to the old code, but a few things have been changed, and then there's an additional parameter. So the first thing I'm doing, I'm no longer selecting the buttons. I'm selecting the report, which is higher up. And the reason I'm doing that, the region container, is because when the report content refreshes this table, the region container does not refresh. So if I place an event binding here, it sticks around. And then I pass click as the first parameter, but now I have a new second parameter, and you can see that that was the selector I used before. And so what's going to happen here, when the button here is clicked, it's going to travel up the DOM tree and eventually get to this region container. And the region container is going to interrogate the event object and say, hey, where'd you come from? And do you match this selector? And if so, it will fire this function. So this is a technique called event delegation. And the cool thing about it in Apex is that it's baked in. You may have even seen this feature before. If you look under the parent section of the dynamic action, under advanced, event scope, dynamic. If you've ever wondered what that was for, that's exactly what it is. Dynamic means use event delegation. It then exposes this optional static container to you for you to use, but really it defaults to the document, so you don't have to put anything there at all. But that is a very, very powerful feature if and when you need it. All right, moving quickly on to leveraging JavaScript hooks. Of course, dynamic actions could never do declaratively 100% of all the things that you can do with JavaScript. And so what the creators of the framework did to make it as powerful as possible is add little spots, little just places, little hooks, as I call them, where provided you know how to use a little jQuery or JavaScript here and there, you can leverage these to extend the framework and use it for much more things than you would otherwise be able to do. You'll find these in two different places. The first, again at that parent level, is going to be the when and the client-side condition. Both of those have some spots, and then when you get down to the actions, you'll find them at the identification and affected elements as well. Let's take a look at a few of these. So we're starting here at the parent level, and we're looking at the event. Now, normally when people are creating dynamic actions, the most common events they're going to use are click, change, and page load, right? Well, that's nice, but what if the event that you want to work with is not in that declarative list of event names? Well, no problem. You select custom, it exposes a custom event field. You can type in the name of any event that you want. A lot of people don't know this. You can actually do a space delimited list of event names and actually bind to multiple events at once. That's pretty cool. All right, moving down from the event and to selection type, the most common things people are binding to are items and buttons. But what if the thing you need to work with is not a typical Apex component? Well, again, no problem. Provided you know a little jQuery or a little JavaScript, there's this option here, jQuery selector. And this is very powerful. You can just put in any jQuery selector you want down here, and then it will bind to those elements. Even more powerful is JavaScript expression. This is the powerhouse. So this example is basic. I'm binding to the document. That's useful, but basic. But if you look at the help while you're focused on that item, you'll see this. And they have a great example here of why this is the powerhouse, because you can use a jQuery selector, like you saw me do a moment ago, but I can also use the methods of jQuery. And whatever this returns, it will bind to those. It can be DOM nodes or jQuery elements. Very powerful stuff. And there's the example of that. So we're still at the parent level, but we've moved down now to the client-side condition. Now this is where we create that fork in the road between the true and the false actions. Most of the time, people are going to be using these declarative options, but the problem is that all of the declarative options are simply binding to a single item and checking the value. So you can see item equals value, item does not equal value, item is null, item is not null. And that's pretty handy, but sometimes you need something a little bit more complex, right? So you have JavaScript expression. This is the powerhouse, and you see an example here where I'm using $V to check the value of two items. This is a compound condition, and if both are true, it will resolve to true. Of course, this expression must resolve to true or false to create that fork in the road. But what a lot of people don't know is that you can get a little wild in here. In fact, you could put an IFI, which is short for immediately invoked function expression. Now, the cool thing about this is that you can declare variables, you can do loops. I don't have an example of that here, but you can do pretty much anything you need to do as long as at the end you return a Boolean, right? So this is super powerful. Of course, you could do it a different way. You could just put a function in the function and global variable declaration section of the page and then invoke that function from there. It's really the same thing at the end of the day, maybe not as much fun, but it works, it gets the job done. Okay, so we're moving down now to the action level. And, you know, the declarative options are great: hide, show, enable, disable, and refresh, which I'll talk about later, very powerful. But whenever there's something that you need to do that is not available out of the box, the option you need is execute JavaScript code. So that ability to write a little bit of code can go a long way. And that's what that's for. All right, moving on to the third area. This is using and debugging Ajax. So what is Ajax? Well, it's short for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but it's a bit of a misnomer these days because, well, sometimes it's actually not asynchronous, it's synchronous. And these days we almost never use XML, we use JSON, but really it's still an umbrella term to describe the general idea of what we're doing. That hasn't changed. So the basic concept is, in your web app, you have a little bit of JavaScript code, and the JavaScript code can issue its own HTTP request. It doesn't rely on a full page cycle from the browser. It can do it itself. So it goes to the web server. Maybe the web server gets some data from the database, and then it sends something back to the JavaScript code. Now, sometimes that might be an HTML fragment. In the case of an interactive report refresh, that's what's happening. Other times it might be JSON data, and then the idea is you're going to use the data to generate the HTML on the client side. In either case, the basic idea is still the same. Now, Ajax and Apex is cool because it's a lot easier than it is typically in other frameworks or environments. And the reason for that is, for one, Oracle database does all the server-side processing. So once you know SQL and PL SQL, you don't have to learn some new language for the mid-tier like Java or JavaScript. You can just do it all with the language you already know. And of course, dynamic actions have lots of declarative options for Ajax, but there are more programmatic options that are available if and when those are needed. The key to getting Ajax to work with Apex is sending in the correct data so that you get the correct response out. There are 3 out-of-the-box options for Ajax in dynamic actions: refresh, just the most common, set value, and then execute PL SQL. And each of these has a place where you can send in the correct data to get the correct response coming out. We'll take a look at each. So refresh can be used on either regions or items. And the example I have here is a report. So you see a SQL query for the region definition. And immediately below that, you see here the page items to submit. So because this query is dependent on the value of this bind variable, you're almost always going to want to have that bind variable's name here in page items to submit. And what that's going to do is ensure that when you refresh the report, it will take the value of the item in the web page. It will carry that back to the server. It will update session state, and it will do all of that prior to executing this SQL query. So very important you get that right. Set value is another dynamic action you can use, very powerful. There are SQL and PL SQL options like SQL statement, PL SQL expression, and so on. It's quite powerful. The SQL statement can have multiple columns to map to multiple items. And again, there's this page items to submit right beneath the query. Make sure you're using that. Execute PL SQL is the last one, and personally, it's my favorite. The reason is just because I feel like you get the entire power of PL SQL, and it can also work with multiple items, and it can go both in and out. So it does pretty much everything you would need to do. So I recommend giving that one a shot first. It does have an option, wait for result. So remember I said that, you know, sometimes your Ajax is actually synchronous. That's pretty much what you're doing there. You're going to queue some things up so you do the other things only when that's finished. That can be handy sometimes. And you notice the page items to submit right below, but there's also page items to return. And I'm going to show you an example of that here in just a bit. Now, when it comes to debugging, you have to use the right developer tools, so make sure you're learning those. I personally have switched to using Edge recently over Chrome, same code base really, just minus the Google stuff. But the idea is in either of those two, you would go to network, and if you're debugging Ajax, you use this little filter here, so you only see the Ajax requests. Again, that's XML HTTP request object, but just read that like Ajax. And so then you can select the request, And then you can inspect it using all these tabs, but it's often very handy to go to headers. And this will show you what has been submitted to the server in terms of, as you see here, items to submit. All right, so that's the first half of the talk, the lecture half. Now what we're going to do is switch to the live demo, and we're going to put all these pieces together. So let's give that a whirl. Now I'm going to create a new application. And we'll call this employees. I'll add a page to it. It'll be an interactive report, which I'll call employee raises. And of course, this will be on the emp table. So we'll get that going here and create the application. And I should say ahead of time, right? This is kind of true for all these demos, but I just want to be clear. The exact demo I'm going to show you today is probably not how I would implement something like this in real life. Obviously, giving employees raises is quite serious, and you wouldn't do it as I'm going to do it. So focus on the concepts here. Focus on the techniques. That's really what we're trying to learn. All right, so here's what I want to do. I have this interactive report. I want to add a column on the right with a button. I want it to say give raise. And when somebody clicks the button, what I want to do is show a region. And I want that region to have a percent input, 10%, 5%, whatever. So they put a percent in, they hit submit, and one of two things happen. They get an error and we handle that, or it's successful and we handle that. That's the basic idea. Let's get started. All right. So the first thing I need to do is add a new column. And by default, what Apex gives me when I use the app creation wizard there, it gives me an IR using a table or view. I'm going to switch that to a SQL query, and they're kind enough to give me the SQL query. So I'm going to add null, and I'm going to say give raise. That looks good. We'll save that and open up our columns. So here's the new column. And if I scroll down, I have this. Oops,
sorry, Dan.
Yeah.
The people can see the demo.
Ah. Apologize. And now?
Okay. Thank you.
Is it working now? Yeah.
Yes.
Good?
Yes.
Okay. Very strange. I'm wondering if I should roll this back a little bit. Let me just start from this point. So I just started a new application from scratch, and it's got an interactive report, and I just want to add a column here with a button to give people raises. So what I did, I went into my region, and I added this null column here. And now I'm going into my new column, and I'm going to configure it. So here I have this spot where I can add an HTML expression. Do you guys know how to write a button? I don't. But luckily, the Apex team makes it easy. If you go to apex.oracle.com/UT for universal theme, they host an instance of this package application, and you can go to reference, button builder, and you can get an idea what this is doing. It's going to give us the code, and we just kind of declaratively configure this. So if you want one with text and an icon, maybe you want it to say give raise, and we'll customize the icon, something, you know, raisey. We'll make it hot, because why not? It's going to be in a report, so I'll make it a little smaller than normal. Under advanced, there's an option which looks weird here, stretch, but it looks better in the report. So once you get your button looking the way you want it, you just grab that, bring it back to the builder, drop it in here for HTML expression, give it a whirl, and woohoo, you have a button. It doesn't do anything, but we'll change that. We're going to bring it to life right now. Okay, So let's create a dynamic action. I go to create dynamic action, and I'm going to call this give raise clicked, and I'm going to say when. Okay, so when there's a click event on a button, and the button is, oh, well, that's weird. I can't select the buttons in my new column because they're non-standard, right? Okay, so this is where knowledge of the JavaScript hooks comes in handy. So this is where you could say jQuery selector, and provided you know how to write a jQuery selector, you could put that in here. What I need to make this work is a hook in the HTML. So if we go back to the HTML, you see I have a number of classes I can target. These are really specific to universal themes. So what I'll do is add my own, give, raise, and I'm adding this JS suffix. It's not necessary, but it can help indicate that you're using this for JavaScript rather than CSS. At any rate, I'll hit OK here. Now I'll go back to my dynamic action, and I'm going to say I'm selecting by class. So I put the period, and here's the class name. So the default show here is fine. I'm just going to switch it to an alert real quick, and we'll do the classic hello world. Save that. Run it. And now you see our button's doing something. All right. Now, what I really want to do is not alert, but rather open a new region so that they can give someone a raise, right? So let's start putting that together. Under regions here, I'm going to create a new region. And I'm going to call this new region give raise. And for the position, I'm going to put this in inline dialogues. And for the template, I'm going to use inline dialogue. Now, the idea here is that when the page renders, they're not going to see this until I want them to. So here, I will create an item, which we'll call P2 raise %. Text field is fine. That looks fine. And then I just need a button, which will be submit raise. We'll make it hot, because why not? And we'll put it, let's see, edit, ought to work. Okay, now all I need to do is go to my dynamic action, change the alert to open region. Of course, it's going to be a region, and that region is my new region, give raise. We'll save that and run it. And now when I click the button, voila, we have our region. But it's not perfect. And there's two issues. Number one, I put in some characters, close it, open another one. They're still there. I want to fix that. But in addition, who am I giving the raise to right now? Right? When the region opens, I lose the context of the row. So it'd probably be good to display the employee name up here, right? So let's do both of those. Now, the first one's easy enough. Right before I open the region, I'm going to create another action. What I'm going to do is simply clear raise %. Simple. All right. The other one's a little more complex. What I want to do is take the value, really like in this case, atoms, and map that into my region so I can display it. Now, sometimes, like when you're working with a classic report, you can rely on what we call DOM traversal. However, in the case of an interactive report, where the user could, if they wanted, hide that column entirely, you can't rely on DOM traversal. So instead, we're going to use another technique. I'm going to put it all right in the button. So if I go back here to give raise, and we open up that HTML again, I'm going to add a custom attribute, an attribute that we call a data dash attribute. Now, these are HTML5 attributes. When you put data dash in front of an attribute name, it's like saying a custom attribute. It can be anything you want. It's still valid HTML. So I'm going to call this one ename. and I'm going to refer to the value from the column ename. So when I do that, and I run the page, if we inspect this, you'll see that we now have ename Adams for that row. If I come down to this row, it's ename Clark, right? So now I have something that's literally embedded in the button that I can leverage. So let's leverage it. I'm going to go back to the dynamic action. I'm going to create a new one, again, before we open the region. And this is going to be execute JavaScript, maybe. Even easier, maybe a little less code, set value. So I want to set the value, and right now I just have the p raised %. So let's go back over here. I'm going to create another item, put it on top, and we'll call this one, ename. And it will be display only. And we'll have the label say employee. That looks good. Go back to the dynamic action. So we're setting the value of that new item, P2 ename. Now the question is, what are we setting it with? Well, again, we have JavaScript capabilities here. And if you look in the help, you'll see that they give you access to different things, including the triggering element. And the triggering element in this case is the button. And the button we know now has a custom attribute called ename. Now the way you access those data dash attributes is with data set. And the property I'm after is ename. So that's really all I need. So we'll save this and rerun the page. Woohoo! There's Adams. That's who we're giving the raise to. We go down, do another. Now it's going to be Blake. And also, if I put a value in, close it, reopen, it's clearing that value out, which is what we wanted. Excellent. So the next part, when we click Submit Raise, I want to execute some SQL, right? I want to actually give somebody a raise. Now, this is where declarative Ajax becomes really powerful. Like, in a lot of environments, it'd be hard. Maybe I have to create a REST API, whatever. We don't have to do any of that here. So I'll go back to my page. I'm going to create a new dynamic action. And it's going to be based on this button, which currently is submitting the page. But if I right-click, go to Create Dynamic Action, it redefines the button so that it is now defined by a dynamic action. It creates my dynamic action and sets some of these defaults correctly. Maybe not always correctly, but in the case of a button, it's almost always correctly. And then I'm just going to change the name here. So we'll say submit raise clicked. So when that button is clicked, the action I want to do is going to be to declarative Ajax. We're going to do execute PL SQL. And this is the first of a couple times. I'm going to grab a little code sample so you don't have to watch me fumbling around writing that from scratch. So here we're updating the employee table, setting salary equal to itself, and then we're doing the arithmetic necessary for the % raise increase that was specified. Now, hopefully, somebody out there has spotted a big problem with this update statement. That's right. We're updating every row in the table, which is not, of course, what we want to do. Instead, I got to add a predicate here where emp no is equal to, oh, well, this is interesting. I'm targeting one row, so it's going to be something like P2 emp no. Now, this item doesn't exist, but it needs to, right? So we'll validate that. It looks good. I'm going to copy this. And remember when we talked about, or I mentioned earlier, the page items to submit, right? We have two items in here, so we need them both here. Now, I haven't created the second one yet, but I can select P2 raise %. And I'm just going to put a comma after that and paste in the emp no to make sure that that's there. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create this item. So this is P2 emp no. This is going to be a hidden item. And I'm not going to leave it protected because I do intend to change its value. So we'll set that. We'll run it. And we'll give our new form a test, right? So I'm going to give Adams a raise. He's currently making 1,100. So we'll say the raise will be about 10%. So we submit it. I guess it worked. And then we'll hit go to verify that it worked. And it looks like it didn't work. Yikes. Where do we go from here, right? This is where you have to learn how to debug Ajax. So you go to that network tab, like I showed you before. And when you come to the network tab, you want to filter on your Ajax, and you're going to see requests here. Now I have this preserve log on, you may or may not. But when I look at that last request, and I'm on the headers tab, and I scroll to the bottom, oops, that was the refresh of the interactive report. Let me drill in on this one. When I scroll to the bottom of this one, what I see here are the items to submit, and I see that the raise percent got a value of 10, but the empno, ooh, that didn't get a value. I missed that. I created the item, but I forgot to map the empno value from the report to the hidden item, similar to what I had to do for ename. All right, let's fix it. So I'm going to go to my dynamic action. Here's the set value I'm doing for ename. We can do the exact same thing for empno, right? So I'm just going to go to give raise. I'm going to add another one of these data dash attributes. So now we're saying empno is equal to empno, and that just has to match a column in the query. Now I can go back to the dynamic action. I'm going to duplicate the current one I have and just map this one instead to empno, and then change this to empno. So I'll save that and run it. And we'll try it again. 10% raise, submit. I think it worked. Close this. And when we refresh, we go from 1,100 to a little bit more, 10% more, 1,210. Perfect. So, so far so good, but of course, we shouldn't have to do that, right? We shouldn't have to do the refresh. That's on success. That we should show a success message. We should refresh the report automatically. We should close the region automatically. That's the success path. There's another path, though. Currently, when we do this, what if somebody does this? Or what if they do this? A little too much, right? We need to have some validation in place as well. And that's going to be like an error path. So we have this fork in the road here. Now to create this scenario, I'm going to enhance the PL SQL code. And this is what's cool about it, right? If you know PL SQL, you can just bake this right in. So where we currently have a simple update, I'm going to enhance this a bit. So to validate the number, I'm declaring a number. And I have this new bind variable that I'm going to need to create, but I'm going to try to convert the raise percent to a number. If it doesn't work, we have an error. Then I'm going to check the value and see if it's between 1 and 10. If it doesn't work, we have another error. And at the end, if we have an error, I'm going to exit out. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and proceed with the same update statement we had before. So error is an example not of bind variable values coming into session state, but rather I need to get this out of session state and back into the web page. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to be sure to put it right here, page items to return, and then I'm going to go create that item. So just like empno, this is just going to be a hidden item, and I'm not going to protect it. Okay, so now, assuming that code works, we have this issue because I have a fork in the road, or at least I want a fork in the road. I want a success path and an error path. Now, dynamic actions give us this ability, right? When you look at a dynamic action at the parent level, we have the client-side condition to create a fork in the road. However, I'm down here. I'm in a true action, and I want a fork in the road. We don't have that ability, unfortunately. But there is a solution, provided you know a little something about how events work in the DOM, and everyone here does, right? So we know we can trigger our own custom events. So what I'm going to do when this finishes, I'm going to create a very simple execute JavaScript action, and all it's going to do is select the document and trigger a custom event that doesn't exist in the DOM spec after giveRaise. So I'll copy that. And what this lets me do is go to my dynamic actions and create a new one. And as for the event, remember, this is where it's not going to be in the select list, but I can go to custom, put in my custom event name, and that's going to happen. We know JavaScript expression. I'm going to put the document in here. So we'll call this after giveRaise triggered. Okay. Now that I've come back to the parent side of things, I can create the fork in the road with the client-side condition. Now, the declarative options here are actually perfect. I can use item is null. I'm targeting that error item. If it has a value, then an error occurred. If it doesn't have a value, it was successful. So if I say item is null, then the true actions become our success path. And what we want to do in this case is very simple. We'll start with just, oops. Let me back that up. Going down to the child, I'm going to set the action to execute JavaScript. And I'm using a very simple API call here to just show a success message. So that's good. And then in the false path, assuming that the error item has a value, what I want to do is the same basic thing. I want to execute some JavaScript, and you know, this is the most JavaScript you'll see today. I apologize for that ahead of time, but sometimes you need a little JavaScript. Okay, so what are we doing? I'm using an API to clear any errors on the page, and then I'm using an API to show some errors. So I'm grabbing the value from P2 error and I'm mapping it to the raise percent item. So once I do that, seems to be an error here. P2 error. Okay, so if error is null, it's success. Good. I think that looks good. We'll see. So we'll give this a shot. Adams is lucky, getting another 10% raise today. Submitted. That worked just fine. Let's do an error condition. So some text. Ooh, that was bad actually. So this is going to be another one of these mapping issues. And that one was not intentional, unlike the other one. Okay, so here's what I'm missing. P2 error, page items to return. I thought I had that done earlier, but I don't want to say that's a bug, but okay. Put in the text, finally. Must be a number. Okay, what about a big one? That's not going to work either. It's got to be somewhere in the middle. And then we get success. Almost done. Of course, what we really want to do on the success path, we also want to go ahead and close the region that's been popped up, the giveRaise region. And of course, at the end, we want to go ahead and refresh the report because they shouldn't have to do that. So we'll refresh the employees region. Now, with that in place, we can give someone a raise. Once again, Adams, 10%. And if we look behind, currently at 1398, submit raise, we get our refresh, we get that, we get the close region. Everything's working brilliantly, right? We're done. Deploy to production. And oh boy, the buttons have stopped working. Now this ties back to the other example I showed you before. Remember, when we refresh that region, our event bindings are gone. So what was the solution? Event delegation, right? If we listen higher up in the DOM where it does not refresh, the event eventually gets up there and it works fine. But how do we do it? It's super easy with Apex and dynamic actions. The one we're looking for is the give raise clicked. No, it's the submit raise clicked. So on this one, I'm going to use the advanced set that to dynamic. Wait, that's not right. It's here. Which event am I trying to listen? We'll just set them all to dynamic. It's one of those two. All right. So here, sorry, it's the give raise clicked. All right, so here we'll do it once, 10% for somebody. Very nice. We try it again after the refresh of the region, and it works fine because we're listening higher up in the DOM. That was quite a live demo. I hope it wasn't too much, but again, it will be recorded. If you do want to learn more about this, if this was perhaps a little woof for today, no worries. Check out this intro to JavaScript for Apex developers. A lot of the things that maybe you didn't get today will make sense then, and then check out this other talk I have listed here. All right, let's open it up to any questions, if there are any. We'll leave that up for now. And by the way, if you're interested in getting the slides for this, perhaps the application itself, I'll put those up on Twitter. So just follow me there. And yeah, there's already a question. Can we get a backup of the app? No problem. I will put that up for you right after this. There's a question. Go ahead.
Yes. The question Juan Carlos Chavez. Can I get the record video of this session?
Of course.
Sorry.
Recorded.
Can you check a copy of this app? Angel Flores.
Yes. So yes, I will share that on Twitter. As for the recording, that's a good question. Where will they go for the recordings after this?
Okay. The other question is, so custom event is a custom dynamic action. We need to define.
So the question, custom event is a custom dynamic action we need to define. A custom event is really just an event with a name that doesn't exist in the DOM specification. So Apex uses custom events. I just used a custom event. They can be handy from time to time, but they're often not needed. But yes, if you needed a custom event, you would have to pick a name to define it. Definitely. Another question, is there a way to pass a CLOB from JavaScript to an Apex item?
Yes.
And it's certainly possible, but using the built-in dynamic actions, I don't believe it is possible. There are a number of plugins that deal with CLOBs that are available on apex.world, which is a website, an Apex community website you can go to. I'll just show you now. If you go to apex.world, and then you go to plugins, and you search for CLOB, you'll see that there are quite a few plugins that have been released, some even commercially supported for working with CLOBs. So those could be a good solution. And if you're comfortable with writing JavaScript code, you could, in theory, just do it yourself as well, using Apex server process and then a page level process for Ajax. You could get a CLOB out that way. Another question, what is the difference of assigning the value to the button versus a hidden item? Well, the difference is a hidden item, I'm assuming you would do that on page load. A hidden item would only have one value for one employee, whereas what I had were many employees and a report. So I needed something that was unique for every single row. So that's the real difference in why I went that route. Is it possible to use the fingerprint sensor on a mobile device using JavaScript? The fingerprint sensor. I'm assuming this is on iPhones with the thumb reader thing. I honestly do not know the answer to that question. I will say that over the years, JavaScript has gotten more and more capabilities, sort of hooks into what's possible in terms of what's supported on the device that it's running on. So we have what are known as, I'm blanking on the term right now, not web components, but APIs, essentially. There's a list that you can search. What I'll do in Twitter after the talk, I'll take this question there and do a quick look, and I'll provide the link to the site that I'm thinking about, where the W3C lists all of these different APIs that are maybe in the process of being built, or maybe they're just in the process of being conceptualized and kind of, how should we put this together? Should we put this together? Maybe there's something there. I've never heard of it. That's probably going to be a native mobile feature, if it's even available there. I don't know, something tells me that might be sensitive. Another question, will I share the PowerPoint document? Absolutely, it will be available on Twitter right after this talk. And another question, how can we write JavaScript code that's reusable to avoid having to write the same code in every page? So I know I keep plugging this intro to JavaScript course here. I touch on that topic here in module 2. So I go through what I kind of see as a progression for an Apex developer working with JavaScript, starting with declarative dynamic actions, then going to these more advanced dynamic actions that you saw here today, then going to page and component level JavaScript, and then finally to application level JavaScript. And it's that last step that has the answer to that question. It's putting JavaScript in a file. And by the way, let me show you this. I know I've gone over here. I'll end this soon. But this is super cool. If you install a plugin from the FOX group, I cannot remember the name of it off the top of my head. I'll put that in the Twitter feed as well. But when you go to shared components, static or workspace application files, it shows this little thing here, which does not normally exist in Apex. And you can even create new files, literally without having to create a file. So if I say test.js, and we save that, now I can literally start typing code in here. And when I hit create, it will, or I'm sorry, rather save, it will save the file to the shared components. So this is a brilliant way to start working with that application level JavaScript. When you start to share that JavaScript across multiple pages, when you get to that point, this is by far the best way to do it. Fantastic browser plugin. This is a browser plugin, not an Apex plugin. This one actually goes into Chrome, or in this case, into Edge. Okay, I know I've gone over. There may be a few more lingering questions, but am I correct?
Thank you.
We should, yes, okay. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Gracias por habernos acompañado en esta sesión. Agradecemos su colaboración y les compartimos, les recordamos que los videos están en lauc.org. Por favor, revisen todas las sesiones que vienen para la semana que viene y esta. Y podemos, en este caso, thank you so much for your presentation.
De nada. Gracias a todos. Y que tengan un linda fin de semana.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Till next time. Ciao.
Ciao.
Yo no sé.